Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Felysha Jenkins. I'm the Program Manager for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Basic Sciences. And this is the second installment of our series for Hidden Disabilities, Conversations in Diversity. And so one of the reasons that I chose this topic of events is because it's something that we're actually doing the research in at Vanderbilt. And it's something that affects people in our community, whether they're faculty, trainees, or staff. And I'm really trying to build some sort of community within basic sciences. I think we do an excellent job at collaborating across research ideas at the university, but I think we can have that grow a little bit more to also include our staff members and trainees who may or may not be in your departments and areas. Like me, I really enjoy getting to meet people. And one way that I can do that is by hosting these and having you all attend. Today, what you'll see as we progress through the series is that most of our panelists are Vanderbilt people. So today we have an all Vanderbilt panelist, and I'm really glad and grateful that they've come out to join us. The first thing that I want to do is let them introduce themselves, tell them, have them tell us a little bit about their connection to Vanderbilt. And then I have a list of moderated questions for us to cover. And if we have time at the end, we'll also accept questions from our audience. One thing that I do want to remind you all of is that this event is being recorded. So I know we'll have a nice, friendly environment in the room, but please don't feel compelled to disclose anything that you wouldn't want everyone to know. And with that in mind, I'll get started and let Dr. Kirabo begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Annet Kirabo. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Medicine, Division of Clinical Pharmacology. And my research is centered on how hypertensive stimuli induce inflammation leading to hypertension. So, and I focus on environmental factors, including excess dietary salt, and how infections also tie in with, I have a lab in sub-Saharan Africa where we look at interaction between HIV, gut microbiota, and hypertension. And I'm here today mainly to talk about my research and what we find in hypertension.
Hi, I'm Danielle Dean. I'm an assistant professor in medicine in the Division of Diabetes and Endocrinology. And I also am in the Department of Molecular Physiology and Biophysics. So my research lab is focused on diabetes and obesity, and we're interested in understanding how nutrients regulate pancreatic islet hormone secretion and the growth of those cells. So my lab primarily focuses on the hormone that increases blood glucose called glucagon, and how the signals that regulate the secretion of that hormone, like amino acids, how the molecular mechanisms of that works.
And I'm Al Powers. I'm an adult endocrinologist in the Department of Medicine. I also am the director of the Vanderbilt Diabetes Center and the Vanderbilt Diabetes Research Center. And so in those capacities, we have a number of faculty members, a number of students, a number of postdoctoral fellows. So for example, in the Diabetes Research Center, we have 140 faculty across 15 different departments and across several of our schools here at Vanderbilt. And in that, we try to promote cooperation and interaction and collaboration as part of that. I also run a laboratory that's focused on the pancreatic islet, and especially how the human islet is affected in diabetes.
Hello, I'm Colleen Niswender. I do not work on diabetes. I'm associate professor of pharmacology, and I'm in the Warren Center for Neuroscience Drug Discovery. And I have been a type 1 diabetic for 41.5 years. And I also have hypertension and some other things as well that we won't talk about today. But I'm here to kind of share my perspective on what it's like to be diabetic.
All right, thank you all for sharing. And as you started speaking, I realized that I didn't say what the topic was for today, but I'm pretty sure you know. Today we're talking about hypertension and diabetes in our community. So with the first question, I wanted to toss that to you, Annette, to begin with. So how do you define hypertension?
Okay. So hypertension or high blood pressure is the force, or when the force of blood acting against your blood vessels. And when you go to the doctor, there are two numbers that the doctor tells you about. There's an upper number, which is called systolic blood pressure, and that is the blood pressure against your blood vessels when your heart beats, when your heart contracts. And then there's another number, that the lower number, that is called diastolic blood pressure, and that is your blood pressure when your blood vessel your heart relaxes. Both these numbers are extremely important. To be normotensive, or you're considered not to be hypertensive when the upper number is less than 120 and the lower number is less than 80. And there's been a debate on what this means between, different organizations, but recently the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology have redefined when you should start to really be scared, if you have hypertension. And that number, when the number starts to get in the 130s, the upper number, and the lower number starts to get to 90, then you really need medical attention.
Thank you. And what about diabetes?
Okay, so diabetes is really a collection of a couple different diseases that are characterized by hyperglycemia, so high glucose. So type 1 diabetes is really an autoimmune disorder where the immune system attacks the cells in the pancreatic islets that make insulin. And through the destruction of insulin, which is responsible for lowering your blood glucose, you can develop diabetes. Similarly, if insulin is not working very well, so you develop what's called insulin resistance, you can also develop diabetes. So, for example, if your tissues like the liver or the muscle that sends insulin are no longer able to take up glucose or to store it properly, this can also lead to hyperglycemia. And so this is more what we think of with type 2 diabetes. And then there's other forms of diabetes as well. So you can have an early onset type of diabetes called MODY, which is typically in young people, but it's not an autoimmune disorder. As well as you can also develop diabetes during certain times in your life, like during gestation. And so you can actually just be transiently diabetic and need to address that for some time. But those are the different types of diabetes.
Yeah, I might just add that diabetes is a term that encompasses a number of diseases that we do not understand very well. So Danielle mentioned type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes, gestational diabetes. But say within the type 2 diabetes category, which accounts for about 95% of the diabetes in the United States, there are likely several different types there that we just are unable to classify appropriately. And so, diabetes is incredibly common in the United States. Around 12% of the adult population has diabetes, and that's been rapidly increasing. Where we are in the Southeast has one of the highest rates of diabetes. And unless you think this is a problem in the United States, there are many more people with diabetes in China, South Asia, India, those sort of things. So it's a growing worldwide population across all the populations in the United States. And it's a very important problem in our health system today. So for example, at Vanderbilt Hospital today, somewhere around 15 or 20% of the people who are in the hospital today will have some form of diabetes. And it synergizes with other disorders to cause more problems. So it often with cholesterol and things like that. And so it's a really important problem for our health center, for our workforce, and for the general population.
Now, when Danielle first started speaking, she said that diabetes itself can be transient. So it can kind of come and be gestational, and then you birth the human, and then you don't have diabetes anymore. So what about hypertension?
Hy- Hypertension can also be transient. There's a condition known as preeclampsia, which is the hypertension which happens only when you're pregnant. And when you birth the child, that hypertension goes away, although research shows that those transient increases in high blood pressure can later in life predispose you to hypertension.
So so they can kind of come and go and visit as they like. That sounds awful. One of the other things that I've noticed is that there appears to be some comorbidity with it, which also sounds terrible, but it just means that they're occurring at the same time. So what else is commonly comorbid with diabetes besides hypertension? Or do we know why they come along with a group of friends?
We don't. And so just when you say, Felysha says comorbid, she means like having two diseases at the same time. They might be related or they might not. I mean, because hypertension is very common, diabetes is very common. So a person could have diabetes and hypertension and they might not be related at all. There are some diseases where they're related. Diabetes and hypertension, the link is not so clear. As we age, we're more likely to have diabetes and we're more likely to have hypertension. But diabetes in itself doesn't cause hypertension.
And vice versa.
Yeah, and I just want to follow up on one other thing, that diabetes it's unusual for it to be transient. Gestational diabetes is the best example of that. And there are some people who have forms of type 2 diabetes that can, where the diabetes can go away. For example, someone who is obese and had bariatric surgery, often the diabetes with the weight loss can go away. But in most instances, it's not a transient disorder.
Thank you. Dr. Power, you mentioned that sometimes, well, not sometimes, but it seems to be across cultures and societies that diabetes, the prevalence is going up. Do we know any reason why that's happening? Is it the food that we're consuming? Is it, what are we doing differently? Are we not working out as much? Why are we seeing the
Yeah, as I mentioned, diabetes is increasing around the world. Some is because we're getting older, right? And so we know that diabetes increases. So for example, 1 out of 4 people in the United States over the age of 65 have diabetes, right? So age is one thing. Also, type 2 diabetes is especially tied to our weight and to obesity. So the more people who are way larger amounts, that also increases the rates of diabetes. But there's still, while when we talk about weight and lifestyle and activity or risk factors, is still also a consensus that there are many other things that are leading to the increased rates of diabetes. One of those are socioeconomic status. So for example, in the United States, let's take Nashville, for example, the rates of diabetes correlate with the housing prices in Nashville. You can go to the zip codes in Nashville. The higher the house is in that zip code, the lower the rates of diabetes, and exactly the opposite. Same is true in the boroughs of New York. So that's a risk factor that we don't understand exactly how that translates into increased rates of diabetes.
If I may add, part of the reason why there are comorbidities, like Dr. Powers mentioned, all you have to do is stay alive and grow old. The world is becoming older and hypertension increases with age. Every person in this room should almost be worried about hypertension at some point in life, because the risk of developing hypertension is over 90% as you grow older. So it is, something not for just some people, but all, even everybody should be worried about. And why, some of the reasons why this occurs, they occur as comorbidities. There are some mechanistic links that have been studied. I have done some studies with Dr. Alyssa Hasty, who is in the audience, where inflammation is a common pathway where leading to both diabetes and high blood pressure. And we have found that this might be even antigenic we study isolevoglandins that are, when you have increased oxidative stress, that can oxidize fatty acids and that can lead to these immunogenic isolevoglandins that have been found in diabetes and hypertension. So that is just one link between both diabetes and hypertension. There's some research that is showing that SGLT inhibitors that were designed to treat diabetes are the best, they reduce cardiovascular risk and they also lower blood pressure.
And so for those of us in psychology, what do those letters mean?
SGLT2. So an SGLT2 inhibitor affects the rate of reabsorption of glucose from the urine back into the bloodstream. And so if you block that, you actually excrete more glucose in your urine and lower your blood glucose that way.
Okay, thank you. Another question that we have for you all, and Colleen, I'd like for you to begin this one, is how are people, I know there's not really a typical diagnosis that happens, but could you share with us how you were diagnosed?
Yeah. So actually my diagnosis was actually pretty typical because I was a child and I had a very common presentation. So, there's a lot of thought that potentially type 1 is caused by you have some type of virus or some type of exposure and then your immune system kind of goes crazy. So I don't remember that part. I remember I went to a Girl Scout camp out and the troop leaders became very concerned about me during this camp out because first of all, I was drinking like copious amounts of liquid, and the liquid that we had happened to be lemonade, which is not a good choice for me. And then I was so thirsty that I was drinking. When we would go on a hike, I would drink out of the stream because I was so amazingly thirsty. And of course, what happens then is that in the middle of the night, so if any of you have been in the Scouts, right, you always have to have a friend to go to the bathroom with you out at the latrine, right? And everyone's like, I don't want to be Colleen's partner because she's going to the bathroom 5 times in the middle of the night. So finally, one of the troop leaders had to take me. And so when we got home, they said to my mom, they're like, I think maybe she has some type of infection or something. So we immediately went to so my diagnosis date is Monday, March 16th at 4 p.m. in the afternoon. We went to the doctor. They're like, you're going to the hospital right now. And so my blood glucose was 648 mg per deciliter when 100 is normal. And so I was admitted, and at that time, it was an inpatient admission for an entire week to learn how to give injections. This is back in the days, we didn't have blood glucose testing at home. It was all urine testing with this little like chemistry kit that you put these chemicals in, and it gave you a range of like rainbow colors depending upon what your urine glucose was. But that was really what your blood glucose was like 4 hours before. So it didn't really help all that much. And, as I was a teenager and therefore pain, I was not very good at taking care of my diabetes during those days, but we can talk more about that if you like. But anyway, that presentation of the extreme thirst and having to go to the bathroom all the time, I mean, that's a very classic presentation of type 1.
Thank you. Yep. What about for hypertension? How's that diagnosed generally? At the grocery store while you're waiting for your aspirin?
Hypertension is called a silent killer. You don't know that you have it until you drop dead or you get a heart attack or you get a stroke, which is usually too late. So, but especially in the US, not so in my country where I was born, but in the US, every time you go to the doctor takes your blood pressure. And most people, if you at least go to a routine checkup, if you have a primary care doctor, they can tell you. The problem is that most of the time when you go to the doctor, the way they measure your blood pressure is not what is recommended, because sometimes you've been walking up the stairs and you get there within 5 minutes, they take your blood pressure and that is not the right way, because when your nervous system is elevated, your blood pressure is likely to be high. So people usually don't know their actual level of blood pressure, and it is recommended that you let someone sit down and you at least 5 minutes, and then after 5 minutes, take another reading, and usually the third reading is what reflects. But some people have blood pressure measurement machines at home, and that is considered the best way to know what your blood pressure is. So it is a silent killer. You don't know that you have it, but you need to have a primary care doctor.
Thank you.
Well, so I was going to say my journey was very different from Colleen's too. So I think it's worth saying that a lot of individuals are diagnosed as adults with diabetes, right? I think probably most of us are diagnosed, and even individuals with type 1, about 50% of those are diagnosed as adults. So I was diagnosed with prediabetes as a graduate student when I was in my 20s. And then I watched my sister and my brother also get diagnosed with diabetes who were much older than me. And so it was kind of like a light switch for me that something just wasn't quite working, at least in our family. And so I actually started getting monitored and was diagnosed with diabetes as a postdoc here at Vanderbilt. And then as a lot of people were able to manage their diabetes if it's more of the type 2 like, and I use like because they, as Dr. Power said, they're not all the same, right? I was able to manage it with just diet and exercise and oral medications. But then when I got pregnant with my daughter, I very rapidly progressed within the first 14 weeks of my pregnancy to insulin dependence. And so that was a really kind of scary time for me because I was newly pregnant and suddenly dependent on insulin to be able to manage my disease, and managing insulin resistance with insulin deficiency is kind of a challenging thing. So I just wanted to say that some people get diagnosed a little later in life with diabetes, and that trajectory can look very different.
Thank you for sharing. So one of the things that I noticed from last week and also this week, last week we talked about ADHD and autism, and some of our panelists were saying, oh, my child does this thing and they got tested and they have ADHD or autism or both. And I also have ADHD and autism or both. So there appears to be that maybe there's a hereditary link between at least diabetes. What about hypertension?
What was the question? I forgot.
Is there a hereditary link between hypertension and
Oh, yes. Yeah, there is a hereditary link. In fact, we just published a paper in hypertension recently. I specifically study the hypertension that is induced by salt. This is, you can be normotensive and you have a salt load, you eat chips, and your blood pressure can go up to the extent, even 20 millimeters of mercury, which can dangerously lead to a stroke. So some people think they are normotensive. They go to the doctor does not know that they're sick, but after you eat salt that we routinely do in the US, and they still get cardiovascular disease. And we just published that, there are some genetic variants, even in rare genetic variants that are not so common in some genes. And the one that we recently published is in the ENAC channel. This is epithelial sodium channel, a channel that is responsible for absorbing salt in the kidney. And we used TopMed database, and we found a strong genetic link between some of the rare variants, even in other cell types, that contribute to kidney disease and high blood pressure.
That sounds equally fascinating and terrifying. One of the other questions I have for you all is, So normally when we're talking about hidden disabilities, there are things that people that are more stigmatized. So it could be, like I said, we talked about ADHD and autism. It could be mental illness, which we're going to talk about next week. And when it's something like that, people don't always want to talk about it. What I've also done and also heard is that people refer back to something like diabetes or high blood pressure, and they say, you know, you don't feel uncomfortable talking about having diabetes. You know, why do you feel uncomfortable talking about, you know, having schizophrenia? So we kind of use these two as models, as things that we're willing to talk about. And I know not everyone on the panel may have an answer for this, but if you do want to disclose that information in your workplace, for those of you who have experienced this before, what do you consider when you're thinking about disclosing, and why might you disclose versus why might you not? And Colleen, I want to start with you for that one.
I've always disclosed, maybe over disclosed, I don't know. But I could sort of feel that, and there was another individual who no longer is at Vanderbilt who was in the center who also had type 1. And so we had a little refrigerator that we used to keep stuff in that was like our stuff, including glucagon and snacks, things like that. And one day she had a very, very bad hypoglycemic episode. We both wore insulin pumps, although different kinds. And her pump had malfunctioned and had given her too much insulin. And she had a very, very severe low blood sugar reaction. But people knew that she was they knew immediately, they're like, something's wrong with this person. And they went and got me, and they were like, help us figure this out. And, you know, we called 911 and all that kind of stuff. So I think in that regard, it can be helpful for other people to know, like, if I start acting like this way, something's not right. For me, the first thing is I can't do any math. I can't really do math well anyway, but it's even worse when my blood sugar is low. I mean, I do think that, though, once you disclose that, and once an episode like that happens, even though people know, okay, this is what's happening, it's still really scary.
Mm-hmm.
And people can be very, you know, like, I don't know what to do. So we actually had in the center, the two of us sent out an email, like, if this happens, this is what we need you to do. And so I think in that regard, it was very helpful because we were able, and she didn't remember the episode at all, actually, afterward. But she was very appreciative that we were there. She did not want to go to the hospital. She was very argumentative, and they had to like kind of tie her down to get her out of there because she really needed to go to the hospital. But in the end, she was very appreciative that people knew and were able to help her.
Thank you for sharing. There was also, I don't know if you want to talk about it, but we also talked a little bit about traveling and what that means for traveling.
Yeah, so so I did my graduate work here at Vanderbilt and left for a while and then came back and have been here for a while. But something that I wasn't really prepared for in graduate school, we were going to a meeting, Society for Neuroscience meeting in lovely Anaheim, California. And there was another student who we were all going to room together. There were 3 or 4 of us. And she went to her advisor and said, I am not comfortable with this because I don't know what to do if something happens, you know, to Colleen. And so we had to talk about that. And eventually we got to the point where she felt comfortable doing that. But traveling is just super hard. And even though I have an insulin pump, when you go across time zones, particularly if you go to Europe or you go, you know, I got invited to a meeting in Australia and I turned it down because that's a really long way to go by myself. And if something happens and I'm around a bunch of people who don't know me or don't know what to do, I just felt I feel very unsafe in those types of situations. And so that can cause me to turn down stuff that might be good for my career, but that I know, you know, I got invited to a meeting at Cold Spring Harbor. I was given a lecture and I got to the airport and I knew my blood sugar was low. And I'm like, no problem. I'll just eat some Skittles or whatever. And then I kept waiting and it wasn't going up. They're calling for the flight. They're like, you have to board. And I'm like, I can't go. And it was the next day and there was no other flight. And so I had to, you know, call these people and say, like, I'm really sorry. This is before COVID. So it was kind of before Zoom and when these kinds of things could be more easily accommodated. And she's like, it's okay, just get better. And I was like, okay, thanks. So I, had to go home. So that
it
kind of
can be
thing can be
scary.
challenging, not just the traveling, but, you're eating out in restaurants. And so you're eating stuff that you don't know how many carbohydrates are in there. And you need that to plan how much insulin you're going to take, right? And so my blood sugar is always just up, down, whenever I travel. So I have to pick carefully.
Mhm.
Or, and also there's this burden that if I ask somebody else like to go with me or travel with me, then I'm like, okay, I'm putting that person in a situation where like they're kind of responsible if something happens, right? And are they comfortable with that? Would they want to do that? And so, just having to think about those things can be
So
a challenge.
being mindful of what your disclosure means and deciding if that's the best thing for you and how to move forward in that. Thank you. Does
Yep.
anyone else want to respond?
As a physician who cares for individuals with diabetes, especially for people who have diabetes that's labile, like Colleen described, we encourage people to let the people around you know. Obviously, your family members know, but let's say you're a college student, we want your roommate to know, right? You work in an environment like Colleen described, we would like for them to know. So I think a limited number of people is we encourage that. But it's up to the person in terms of to whom they want to disclose that. But I think for safety reasons, if you have labile diabetes, someone in the place that you live and work should know in case something happens like Colleen described.
So this goes to my next question. Can people who have hypertension or people who have diabetes 1, 2, or gestational, can they be successful at work? Is that even possible?
Absolutely. I mean, there are treatments. There are, for hypertension, there are treatments. You just have to know your numbers. I think you have to know that you have hypertension and whether you have salt sensitive hypertension. So we have a study ongoing right now where we are recruiting people to phenotype you for your salt sensitivity so that you feel safe when you're eating a high salt diet, that you're not endangering yourself, because it's really important for you to know. And especially salt sensitivity is something that the doctors are not equipped to diagnose right now. So we are trying to figure out how that can be done feasibly in the clinic. But you can, you can live a full life a full life expectancy life, because research has come up with many medicines for treatment of hypertension.
So I'll just answer the question about can you be successful with diabetes by looking to my left and to my right. Those two individuals are incredibly successful, right? Not only personally, but professionally, right? So they mentor graduate students. They've written many papers. They have grants. And so absolutely one can be successful with diabetes. For example, one of the Supreme Court justices has type 1 diabetes. A former prime minister of England had diabetes. So absolutely one can be successful.
Thank you for answering that. I love to ask that question because there's still some stigma associated with even people saying knowing their numbers or going to the doctor and being assessed. Like, oh, if it's my time to die, it's just my time to die. Maybe if they have a defibrillator and they do all that and then you die, maybe it's your time, but let's try everything before that first. So I always want people to know that there still is room for being successful or being happy and healthy if we know what to do next. So my final question, and if we have time, if you all have questions, you can ask those as well. We have about 10 more minutes, but my final question, you've touched on it just a little bit, but in what ways can we be allies to those who have hypertension or to those who have diabetes? For those of us who don't, how can we be there and be supportive of our peers who do?
One thing that helps me is when the people in meetings I go to allow me to sit very close to the door, because I often have to go to the bathroom. And people will be like, Colleen, why are you going to the bathroom so much? So then this gets into this discussion. Things like just being aware, like that something's not, like when I'm not feeling well and I go in my office and I close the door and I put the sign on there, like, don't bother me. I'm usually in there like cramming. Okay, I have to tell a story about raisins. So I hate raisins. The reason that I hate raisins is that I was diagnosed right before Easter, and there's nothing sadder than a grass-filled Easter basket with raisins in it. Sorry, no jelly beans. And then Halloween also sucked. So I don't like raisins, but don't bring me raisins. Yeah, so I mean, I think just, I don't know that there's specific things I think to me, but I think most people that I work with know me by now. They're like, oh yeah, Colleen has to go to the bathroom. And I also drink a lot of Diet Coke. So, but for other accommodations and things like that, I mean, I know there's something that came up during our pre-meeting was things like dietary support at meetings or other places like that. And I think that can be useful, although I admit I pretty much eat mostly. And now that I have an insulin pump, I eat a lot of stuff I probably shouldn't. But, I really like ice cream and I really like candy, and I know. Anyway, so that's what I would say.
So how can we support the people that with heart? I'm involved in the American Heart Association a lot, and there is even an online link to register for volunteering. We have heart walks that you can go and volunteer and have an opportunity to tell someone else to even get their blood pressure checked, or even, I have a personal story here. I don't have hypertension, but my dad came and visited me just before the pandemic. And because I have a blood pressure machine at home, I saw that he was hypertensive, and I told him he needs to get on medicines. And he refused. And with all the love that I can in my heart, I love my dad, but he can be very stubborn because he thinks that, he knows more than me, but, and when during the pandemic, I couldn't be able to go see him. He got a stroke that almost, took his life and left him incapacitated. And he didn't feel he was sick. He didn't feel he needs any medicines, but he had an opportunity before this happened. And so sometimes I just feel mad at him for not listening to me. And even in the study we have right now, there are people that we recruit that are not on medicines, and they just realize they're hypertensive, and sometimes they realize their hypertension is based on the diet they eat, and they're able to make really moment by moment, meal to meal decisions. So that being educated, and you tell a friend to tell a friend, is one way to support and also to be involved in organizations, donating and going for walks.
I will always be a proponent of the heart walk. Absolutely, because, and even if you do know, if someone has confided in you, you also know that that is not your information to share with others, because maybe they don't want to share with everyone, but they do need at least one person in their office to know what's going on. So I think that's something we also have to be mindful of. I will always be a proponent of the heart walk. Back in the 1900s, when I first lived in Nashville, we did a heart walk, and I was in HR, and my supervisor came, her husband came, our colleagues were there, and about halfway through the heart walk, she started having chest pain, and she had to stop. And she needed stents put in. Didn't know she had any heart issues. She was about maybe 65 years old at the time, and that potentially saved her life, because she had to have the stents put in. She was able to come back to work, but then decided to retire a little later on, and is still living here today. But because we did that heart walk, and we were just out there having some bonding time as a corporation, we were able to find out that she needed that, and it could have saved her life. So I love the American Heart Walk. Those are all the questions that I have for you all. Do you all have anything that you wanted to share? Are there questions in the audience?
I just want to say that I feel safer as a lab, someone who manages people. I feel safer if I know they have a condition, and those that have disclosed to me, it's almost equips me and to watch out for them. So I'm a proponent of letting someone know that can do something about what you have.
Thing is to not underestimate people who might have these conditions. Someone that I work with was told she was diagnosed with type 1 when she was 9, and her doctor told her that she could never have children. And then she met me and she said, "You have 2 kids. Like, how did that happen?" And so then I said, you need a different endocrinologist. And then there was someone I met just recently at a meeting who is a grad student and was diagnosed during COVID with type 1. And he told me that his doctor said he should leave science because it was too stressful and that he should find something else to do. And I said, I'm not having that. No way, man. And I think obviously that's an individual choice, right, as to how you handle the disease and what you can handle. But there are people out there that are successful with these things, and
Absolutely.
yay us.
Yeah. So remember when you all scoffed when I asked the question, can you be successful? And then she shares that during the pandemic, the person found out they had type 1 and someone told them they should leave science. So that was not 100 years ago.
That was very, very recent. And we didn't get into kind of, was his doctor at a large medical center? Was this a general practitioner in a small town, or, why this was that this individual had this perspective. And maybe it was something that he, as the patient, said too, like, I'm having trouble dealing with this or something, but he sent me this long, like, follow-up email, like, thank you so much for just telling me that this is possible. So.
And this is why we have these conversations. All right. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you come back next week when we're talking about mental illness, and then October 27th when we'll discuss long COVID. But please give our panelists a round of applause.